Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kaylee Lines.
It's the state that could decide the balance of power in the Senate, and the president is on his way. Welcome to the Thursday edition as President Trump makes his way to Texas to support Ken Paxton in a critical race that is too close to call. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Tyler Kendall today in Washington. Tyler, Ken Paxton is behind in some polls and way behind in the money race. See if the president can change that for him.
I mean, a historically close race, Joe, considering this is a reliably red seat.
Well, that's for sure.
Polling showing us that he's trailing James Tallarico when it comes to that race. But to your point, money, cash on hand in June, Paxton had $2 million compared to his Democratic opponent, $21 million.
That's right. So the president gets on Air Force One to raise some money. He's going to be holding an RNC fundraiser with Ken Paxton later on. Something we'll talk to Kate Sullivan about live at the White House, which has been full of news today. Press secretary's last day, we're told. Is that true for Caroline Leavitt? Last day.
Caroline Leavitt. Still questions about who's going to take her spot, if anyone at all.
There's a big name game that's underway here in Washington, but I don't feel like we're much closer to deciding who wins this season of The Apprentice. John Herbst is going to be with us as well, former ambassador to Ukraine. Tyler, it's time to take a closer look at what's happening there with bare-knuckle attacks on a nightly basis from both sides.
And now Bloomberg News reporting this morning, according to 3 sources close to the Kremlin, that Russia is looking to ramp up attacks, escalation that could potentially look like hitting the key city of Kyiv, or maybe even going after critical energy infrastructure as we get closer to winter.
Yeah, we'll have a lot to unfold here with Kate and with the ambassador on a market day that's been fascinating. This day after Nvidia earnings, we're really picking winners and losers here in the AI race.
And the day before, Kevin Warsh addresses the Jackson Hole Symposium. We'll catch up with Michael McKee later this hour, too. But right now, we have to catch up with Charlie Pellet from World Headquarters in New York for the latest on the markets. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Tyler and Joe. Lots going on. We got you covered here at Bloomberg Balance of Power. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all pushing higher, not just higher right now on the S&P, but best level of the day. Right to the numbers here. After Nvidia's blowout report, we got the S&P up 62, up 0.8%. Dow Industrials up 206 on the Dow, gain there of 0.4%. NASDAQ up 407 points now. For the NASDAQ Composite Index, that is a gain of 1.6%. NASDAQ 100 Index up 1.3%. All of this with the SOX, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange's Semiconductor Index, now up by 2%. The VIX holding above 14 now with the 2-year, 4.21%. The 10-year ahead of Kevin Warsh tomorrow, 4.66%. The 30-year, 5.18%. Gold up $23 the ounce to $46.14 for spot gold, up 0.5%. West Texas Intermediate crude 82.79 a barrel. WTI up 0.7%. Brent 88.89, up by 1.2%. Nvidia jumping after earnings. It is the chip maker at the heart of the AI boom. It says revenue will grow about 70% next year. That's going a long way to ease concerns that AI spending is poised to lose momentum. Nvidia right now up by 9.6%. Among other chip names, Advanced Micro Devices down 1.4%. And shares some of the other names that are moving after earnings today. We got CrowdStrike up 18.3%. Also after earnings, Salesforce.com up now by 21.2%. So an update for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ. Speaking of Nvidia, it has launched a political action committee to dole out donations to federal candidates, the company's latest move to build a high-powered influence apparatus in Washington. The Nvidia Corporation Employees Federal Political Action Committee will be funded by voluntary contributions from eligible employees and capped at $5,000 a year. And Joe and Tyler, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. What a market today. This will be really interesting to see how things develop as we get ever closer to the late edition of Balance of Power. Charlie will be back with more on the markets in about 15 minutes, closer to 20 minutes time here. Something we do every day on Balance of Power as we connect the dots between Washington and Wall Street. We're spending some time on the campaign trail, and it's really interesting to get past the bulk of the primaries and start investing ourselves in the general election cycle that most think begins roughly around Labor Day. That's kind of the unofficial start. And Tyler, that's when we're told that voters really start to crystallize their ideas when it comes to particularly domestic issues, and in many cases start really making decisions that are hard to change once the politicians start running ads later in the cycle as we get closer to November. That's why the president's getting on a plane today.
And the president has had a relatively strong record when it comes to the primary season. And now the question becomes, how does that translate into the general with such slim margins and Democrats trying to flip some races and some seats? Interestingly enough, maybe Texas could be in their sights, as recent polling is showing us Ken Paxton, who has the president's backing, currently trailing. So we're going to have to see about how big of an impact the president could have tonight, not just in the polls, but also when it comes to the money. And for that, we're going to check in and head to the White House and check in with Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, who is standing by to help us preview this trip. Kate, I wanted to chat with you about some of the defining issues in this race in particular. If we bring all of the different threads together, we're actually seeing data centers become perhaps the most pressing issue in this race. I pulled some polling. A Texas University poll shows 57% of Texas voters say they don't want to see data centers in their community. This is an issue where President Trump has actually gone up against the governor of Texas on. What do we know about how this is defining politics right now?
That's right. I mean, there are a number of really critical issues in this midterm election. Data centers, as you mentioned, affordability, also the economy, how the Iran war is impacting that. You know, the president he recognizes how important it is to get out on the trail and really spread his message and try to boost Republican candidates. He's heading to Houston, Texas today. He's going to be leaving in just a few hours. We'll see him headline a Republican National Committee event tonight. And tonight, you know, is really about trying to inject some cash into Ken Paxton's campaign in particular. The president, of course, backed Ken Paxton, who is running against Democrat James Tallarico. It's a very closely watched race. A lot of people want to see how, Texas has not elected a Democrat to statewide office in more than 30 years, but poll after poll shows that this race is quite competitive, which could say a lot about the makeup of the Texas electorate, as well as just the wider midterm elections and the trends that we're trying to see there. The president will be heading to that RNC event tonight, and then he's got a very different kind of event tomorrow. He'll be at the NASA's space headquarters there in Houston, and he'll be meeting with Artemis II crew to give the Congressional Space Medal of Honor to that crew. You'll remember, of course, Tyler and Joe, how much that crew captivated the nation's attention when they made history and went around the moon earlier this year.
Yeah, it's pretty unusual. He's not spending the night in his own bed. The president usually heads home, gets back on the plane the next day. So I guess we've got an overnight in Texas here with polls that you referred to, Kate. Ken Paxton at 39% to James Tallarico's 42%, according to the University of Texas. If the election were held today, who would you vote for? Very straightforward and blew some minds. Some folks thought it was an outlier, but when you look at the money, it's nowhere close. Tyler mentioned this a couple of minutes ago, Kate. Ken Paxton with $1.7 million and James Tallarico with more than $21.5 million cash on hand. Can the president make a difference when it comes to the money tonight? This is what, a $500,000 a plate dinner?
That's right. It's a huge fundraiser. We'll see. I mean, the president does, as you mentioned, has a good track record with his endorsement. Does matter. But of course, it's not the only thing that people care about. And this midterm elections, we've seen just Republican voters, but just voters in general. They are really struggling when it comes to the economy, when it comes to affordability, when it comes to affording grocery prices, gas prices. Of course, we've talked a lot on this show about the war in Iran and just how much it's affecting just the economic ripple effects that are coming from that. There's really no end in sight when it comes to that war, and it's having a huge impact in people's pocketbooks.
Just to qualify that, Tyler, the tickets start at $10,000 per couple. They go as high as $443,000 for top-tier access. So this could be a blockbuster if he plays it right. And
it is also underscoring the push here when we're looking at the difference between how much cash on hand these candidates have. And we are in an environment where the ad impact really does make an impact. And to pick up on Kate's point right there, there is a dovetailing right now when it comes to domestic and foreign policy. And Kate, before we let you go, we have to turn to another story that we're closely tracking. Bloomberg News reporting that the Kremlin could soon escalate the conflict with Ukraine. We're learning about this rare visit that the CIA Director John Ratcliffe just made to Moscow. What can you tell us? What are we learning about what was discussed there?
That's right. So it was a surprise visit, an unannounced visit. It was brief. Ratcliffe went to Moscow, and it was the first time that we know about, the first publicly known trip that Ratcliffe has made to Moscow. Now, the White House has not provided many details about this trip at all, but reports show that he was there to really give Russia a warning not to attack any NATO member countries. This is as European and American officials have become increasingly concerned that Moscow could launch some kind of limited assault or limited incursion on a neighboring country, perhaps on a NATO member country. There are also reports that Ratcliffe was there to encourage Russia to stop doing business with Iran, to limit their economic and military support of Iran. This is, of course, after Besant announced Operation Economic Outcast, and as the administration is trying to squeeze Iran and really isolate them on the world stage.
Kate, it's great to have you. Kate Sullivan with us live from the White House as we add the voice of Ambassador John Herbst. We told you he was coming, and we're looking forward to this conversation. The former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Ambassador Herbst, it's great to have you back. We're looking forward to getting your take on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, but I'm first would love to hear your reaction to this trip that the CIA director made to Moscow. It's something we don't see very often these days, and I'm wondering if you think Vladimir Putin heard the message.
Well, this means that the reports we had, first coming from Baltic intelligence services, and then from our own intelligence services over the past few weeks, that Putin is seriously considering some form of kinetic activity, some sort of military strike on the Baltic states or maybe other NATO members in Eastern Europe, is real, and the administration takes it very seriously. Ratcliffe understands that Moscow considers us to be its principal adversary, and a strike against those states is a strike against us. So I welcome him going to Moscow to tell him not to do it. Excuse me.
If we're potentially pointed toward escalation here, there was a time where it felt like we may be making progress. The U.S. had committed to firm security guarantees, for example, for Ukraine, after months of saying that those guarantees should instead be implicit. Where do we stand in this negotiating process after what were months of talks? Are we really back to square one?
The talks were moribund by the end of last year. You're right that President Trump began to move within the negotiations towards a position of greater strength, as represented by progress on security guarantees, and represented by the sanctions he put on Rosneft and Lukoil, two major Russian hydrocarbon firms, at the end of October. Mm-hmm. But then we also offered some ideas which made no sense to my judgment, either for Ukraine, but especially for the United States, like Ukraine handing to Russia as a gift strategic territory in Western Donbass that the Russian army has been unable to take. So the push made by the administration has not been one consistently of peace through strength. But Ratcliffe, again, is a very serious man, understands the danger that Moscow's aggressive policy represents to the United States. So his visit to Moscow to say knock it off is a plus, in my judgment.
There's some pretty terrifying reporting by the Wall Street Journal this morning on the status of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Described as entering a new phase, Ambassador, with expanded aerial arsenals and inadequate air defenses, both sides bludgeoning each other, and what they call a bare-knuckle fight causing a widening swath of destruction and a rising civilian toll. How long can this go on for?
Well, I think that report is only basically correct. It's inadequate, though.
Okay.
What's happened
Why?
is they're right about the difficulty of Ukraine to stop Russian ballistic missiles because they don't have many of our Patriot interceptor missiles, which are the only ones that work for that. And the Russians have been unable to stop Ukrainian drones because their territory is vast. But Russia is trying to terrorize the Ukrainian public by targeting civilians. Ukraine is avoiding that. Ukraine is striking at strategic targets, hydrocarbon facilities, because without oil and gas, the Russian war machine won't run, going after munitions plants, going after key transportation nodes. So Ukraine strikes are weakening Russia's ability to conduct the war. Russia strikes are merely killing civilians. That's the bludgeoning. That's the brutality.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
If we continue on this, can you put into context the options left on the table for Ukraine when it comes to bolstering their own defense weapons stockpile and base? You mentioned those Patriot missiles. It was back at the G20 when President Trump had suggested that there was a deal to grant Ukraine the general license to build these on their own. But at this point, it doesn't seem like that deal is going to come to fruition.
Well, sadly, what you're saying is true. President Trump said when he met with Zelensky at the Ankara NATO summit in, I don't know, like the 10th of July, that he would license Ukraine to do it. To build those missiles, which would take time, but it would be a strong step in the right direction for us, for Ukraine, for NATO. And he said he saw Zelensky in the Oval Office 2 weeks after that, and they spoke as if that's what the deal was. But then 2 days later or 3 days later, the president said, no, I only said I was going to consider it. So here he was being inconsistent in ways not good for Ukraine's security, but also not good for American security. Giving Ukraine that capability, or rather licensing them, will increase the production of Patriot interceptor missiles, which not only Ukraine needs, but the United States needs, our allies and partners around the Persian Gulf need it, NATO needs it. So this would be the smart move. It would be good to see.
What did you think when Vladimir Putin talked about Ukraine opening Pandora's box last weekend? He was asked about some of the attacks that Russia has experienced from Kyiv. He said, we'll be ready to get a blowback on your most sensitive sectors of the economy. He will use coal as a weapon again this winter, right?
Oh, no doubt about it. Look, Putin's been doing this. He's been going after Ukrainian infrastructure since the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in the late summer and early fall of 2022. So this is nothing new. Putin has no new tactics that he has been putting into place. All he does is smack the Ukrainian economy and Ukrainian civilians. Whereas the Ukrainian drone offensive we've seen since roughly late March, early April, has been devastating to Moscow's production of oil and gas, to its ability to supply its own troops at the front, to its ability to supply Crimea, which is now quasi-isolated. All of those things have clear strategic and military value. Putin strikes only murders Ukrainian civilians. But I just came from Kyiv. I was there for 3.5 days. While I was there were many very, very senior European officials, so the Russians did not bomb Kyiv. But over the last 18 hours, they've been bombing the heck out of Ukrainian civilians, especially in Kyiv. And so scores of civilians have died. It's pure terror. It's pure war crimes.
We do want to continue with the conversation related to oil, and I want to bring you a redhead that's crossing the Bloomberg terminal right now. Axios reporting that the Trump administration is in talks with Venezuela's interim government about taking an ownership stake in the country's enormous oil resources. This, according to 2 U.S. officials speaking with Axios. This is a historic deal which could more than double the U.S. oil reserves by drawing on the country that has the world's largest proven reserves. Let's stick on the idea of oil, on sanctions. I want to get your thoughts here about economic pressure. Very quickly, we're watching the White House threaten economic pressure against Iran. How effective has sanctions and secondary sanctions been when it comes to the conflict with Russia and Ukraine?
They've been effective. They have taken a percentage point or two off the Russian economy over the years, but not effective to the point where Putin says, okay, I'm going to make a just peace, or I'm going to make even a stable peace. Trump has offered Putin favorable terms for a stable peace, terms which Ukraine would be willing to accept, but the Russians have refused each and every one of those proposals because Putin's aim is political control of Ukraine. And that's not Trump's aim. Trump wants a stable peace, and Ukraine wants to be a sovereign country, not living under the Russian boot, full with Russian war crimes.
All right, John Herbst, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, thank you so much for joining us here on Balance of Power. We'll have more up ahead. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here on Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. We've got stocks continuing to push higher as Nvidia rallies after earnings. Nvidia now up by 9.7%. S&P up 63. We're at 77.39, up 0.8%. The Dow up 0.4% right now at 53,668. I'm Charlie Pellet. That Joe Mathieu and Tyler Kendall is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, keeping it sweet as we bring you straight to the White House. The President of the United States actually talking about the stock market right now, which he calls at an all-time high. He's got Jamieson Greer, the USTR, and the Interior Secretary Doug Burgum with him, and a map of the Great Lakes. Let's listen on Bloomberg.
Also, Japan, South Korea, and Germany. So we're doing things that nobody's ever done before. But the stock market just hit 81 times in a short year and a half period. It's just hit its all-time high again. I want to congratulate Darlene Graham on her tremendous victory on Tuesday night. And she's sailing now. She's really doing great. She's still got to run against a radical left lunatic. And the South Carolina people are not going to stand for that. I know South Carolina very well. I won it every time by record numbers, have the all-time record by millions of votes. But I just want to congratulate Darlene for having run really a great race. And she's going to be a great senator, and the people love her. There's something about her that's very special. She's got a little Lindsay in there somewhere, got good genetics. So Lindsay's looking down very, very happy and very proud of her sister. So congratulations, Darlene. And finally, I guess the purpose of this more than anything else is we're going to be changing the name of Lake Ontario, effective immediately, to Lake America. That's going to take place right now as I sign the order. Do you have anything to say about it, Ben?
Yes, sir. So this is a straightforward but important executive order. It directs Secretary Burgum and the Department of the Interior to update the Geographic Names Information Service to reflect that the lake once known as Lake Ontario will, from this day forward, be known as Lake America. This is a lake that has most of its volume in the United States. The deepest parts of the lake sit in United States territory, so this will reflect that this is an American lake.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. And we filed all the necessary papers, documents, everything else. We notified all of the various people that we have to notify. So we've done everything that you have to do. And this is official, effective immediately. Do you have any questions, anybody?
Mr. President,
Yes.
that video you put up yesterday, of you crossing out Lake Ontario and writing Lake America, it's been seen by about 30 million people, maybe more, across all the social media platforms. What message are you sending to Canada with this move today, and why was it such an important thing for you to do?
It's an interesting question. No message. As you know, Canada's been ripping us off for a long time on trade, very sadly. Even the military, you know, we defend Canada for nothing. We don't get anything. They don't pay us to defend Canada, but we defend Canada, and they understand that. As an example, we bought icebreakers. They'd like to use them. We have 11 brand new icebreakers coming in. They'd like to use the icebreakers. They don't pay for anything. And they want to be treated like a state, but they're not a state. But they want to be treated like they're a state. And so we just can't do that anymore. We lose, on average, over the last 15 years, $60 billion a year carrying Canada. So we just can't do it anymore. We love the people of Canada. I don't think their representatives do an appropriate job. Maybe they'll change. I really don't know. I mean, it doesn't make much difference. But we can't let the whole Canadian thing has been going on for decades, and it has to come to a stop. So we're going to be doing tariffs on their cars that are coming in at a substantial level, because we want to make the cars here. We don't want, you know, if they can make their own cars if they want, and they can continue to make their cars for Canada, but we don't want them to make cars for the United States of America. It's very simple. Likewise, many other products. So the lake change, Lake of America, was something I've been thinking about for a long time, actually. As you know, we took something called the Gulf of Mexico. We changed it, and now it's very routinely the Gulf of America. So if you think about it, we have a Gulf and we have a lake. Now all we need is an ocean. So maybe we'll have to change the name of the Atlantic and/or the Pacific. Maybe we'll change them both.
Why are you so focused on doing things like this towards America's allies instead of doing things that...
Well, they haven't treated us well. The Canadian officials have treated us very badly. They're nasty people. They charge our farmers 400% tariffs. They've been doing it for a long time. And I had them figured out in my first term, and I did some pretty strong things and had it getting pretty good. And then the election was rigged, and now I'm coming back and doing it the way it, and finishing the job. But they treat us very badly. Canada treats us very badly. I would say that of all countries, as you know, we have President Xi coming in a couple of weeks. We deal with a lot of people, and people oftentimes, they'll ask me, who's the worst to deal with on trade? And I said, that's easy, Canada. They are the worst to trade, and they feel entitled, and just we can't have that.
Mr. President, Ted Cruz keeps teasing a 2020 presidential run. You run against him for president. Do you think he could be president? What's your reaction to that?
You say he's going to run? Or?
He's teasing a 20. He's talking about it.
You don't mean 2020, but you mean...
2028.
Yeah. I would say that he's very talented. He's a very good friend of mine. I think he might do that, yeah.
Mr. President,
He's a talented guy.
Mr. President, what's your reaction?
What would you say to those who are concerned a trade dispute with Canada could affect American affordability ahead of midterms?
Well, ultimately, it's going to be very good for us because we're losing, when you talk about affordability, we're losing $62 billion a year on average with Canada. And if you really look at it, we're losing more than that. It's too much. It's too much. We can't lose that. We don't want to lose that. We don't want to lose it anymore.
Mr. President, has Vladimir Putin agreed or committed to not attacking a NATO territory?
I've had good talks with him. He's not going to be attacking a NATO territory.
Mr. President,
the Supreme Court earlier this week ruled on mail-in ballots, and there are states like North Carolina that have ballots that go out next week. How are states supposed to implement this?
Well, they're able to. North Carolina's great. It's a great place. I won it all 3 times. They do some mail-in ballots, but basically they ruled on the legitimacy and the way we want to make them legitimate. And it was a great ruling for the Republican Party.
Why is he voting by mail, sir? You say it's a concern.
Deliver a warning to Russia not to attack NATO territory during his...
Well, I don't want to comment on that, but they're not going to attack.
What's your reaction to the Americans missing in Nepal?
Oh, it's terrible. No, and we've called Nepal and we've offered any help that they need. You know, we have a very good relationship with Nepal, and that was that was mud and water as a mixture. Nobody's ever seen anything quite like that. We're very powerful, strong, well-built buildings were wiped out like they were toothpicks. That's a terrible thing. No, we are sending aid, and we've spoken to the leadership, and we let them know anything they want we'll have. And there were 50, maybe 60 Americans over there. We haven't gotten the full list yet, but hopefully they're okay. But that looked like something that people will not be. Somebody will be lost, unfortunately.
There is reports that Vladimir Putin is meeting with the president of Iran to talk about a nuclear agreement next week. Is there concern in the administration, in the White House, that these countries aren't taking economic D-Day seriously, that they're going to continue doing business with Iran despite the warnings?
No, Iran is right now, they're not paying their troops. They're in deep trouble. They have very little capacity. Last night we took 24 boats through the Strait. We're taking them through all the time. I say it very openly. It doesn't mean we're finished with the military, but we are. The Strait is open, as you know. The Strait of Hormuz is open. We have control, and we have the blockade. Iran's not getting anything. Nothing is going through. Not one ship has gotten through.
Will you punish Putin or Russia if they continue
Well, it
to
depends.
do business
It depends. So far, I think Russia's behaved quite well, having to do with the Strait of Hormuz. And you have to understand, for everything they do, we do also. You know, somebody was saying about China, what about China? We hear they're spying. We spy on them too. That's the way it goes.
Why not sanction Chinese banks, though, who are doing business
Well, who said I'm not? You said, why not? I mean, who said I'm not?
President didn't announce
You don't know if I'm doing it. Well, I don't have to announce everything, do I?
Mr. President, sir, about what other leaders have you spoken to about this pressure campaign to get them to cut off ties with Iran?
About Iran? There's not a lot to speak to. We don't want to speak to them. We're not looking to meet or anything. The Strait is open. We're taking a lot of boats. Millions and millions of barrels of oil are coming out of the Strait every day. Other countries recognize that. Every once in a while they shoot some, they put some shots at. We totally cleared the Strait we have the best minesweepers in the world. They're underwater minesweepers. And we've totally cleared the Strait of mines. And we're watching very closely through Space Force, which is one of my things, one of my many things. But we're watching, we see every inch of the Strait. And any boat goes in with a mine, we see it, and we take it out. We've taken out 2 of them. Thank you. So I'll be going to Texas, and we're working very hard. We want to win that race. He's running against a man who should never be. We have a very good candidate, Ken Paxton, and he's running against Telefrico, they call him, because he is a little freaky, and that's not a man that represents the value of Texas. So I'm going to help Ken Paxton, and I'm going to spend a lot of time in Texas. I have the all-time highest vote in the history of Texas also, and I'm going to spend some time there. We'll be going tonight. Some of you are going with me. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
All right, looks like that's all we're going to get as reporters are removed from the Oval Office after a brief exchange with President Trump, who assembled the White House press corps today to take the motion of renaming the Great Lake of Ontario. Lake Ontario, as he had suggested earlier, will be renamed Lake America, but that's not exactly what the questions were focused on. Thank you for joining us here on Balance of Power. That was live from the Oval Office on Bloomberg TV and radio, with the president saying that he has had talks with Vladimir Putin. Really interesting, as we were just discussing the war with Russia and Ukraine with Ambassador Herbst. Putin not attacking NATO territory, he said, asked repeatedly about that, to say that Putin will not attack. He wouldn't describe more about what he knew. Asked about Iran, they're in big trouble. He said they are not paying their troops. Asked by Bloomberg's Jen DeLuey just there in the Oval Office about why we are not talking with Iran. Not too much news to come out of that event today, other than an executive order, it seems, to change the name of Lake Ontario to the Lake of America. He also floated the idea of changing the name of an ocean. I'm not sure exactly how that would work. Thanks for being with us again. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Tyler Kendall in Washington as we assemble our political panel to get their take on everything we just heard. Remembering the president is on his way to Texas today, as he mentioned, to help raise money for the RNC and for the Ken Paxton Senate campaign. Rosemary Becchi is with us, our Republican strategist, founder and president of Jersey First. Doug Farrar, principal at Maywood Strategies, our Democratic strategist. We've been talking, guys, about this race in Texas. And Rosemary, the question is whether the president can bring the dollars needed. There's a massive disparity when it comes to cash on hand between these two candidates, Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, and the man that the president just referred to as Telefrico, that's Democrat James Talrico, who is leading not only in money, but in some polls, granted, within the margin of error. What does this visit mean for the campaign tonight?
Oh, I think it's very important for the campaign. As you pointed out, they've got to do a lot of catch-up work. And so hopefully they will be raising quite a bit of money. I mean, it's going to be a close and expensive race. So tonight really is important.
One of the areas in this race where we actually saw the Democratic candidate come out early and often to talk about is data centers. We were talking about this earlier in the program, Doug, but I'm wondering if this is an area where either side of the aisle really has been able to get a coherent message out, given how difficult it is right now to connect with voters on the issue of data centers. A University of Texas poll finding 57% of Texas voters don't want a data center near them.
I think the Democrats are doing a great job on this, and I think it's because they've had leaders like Bernie Sanders and others who've come out really strong and been talking about data centers for more than a year. Look, there are some people like Abbott who are trying to distance themselves from data centers. Donald Trump loves data centers, and he says it as often as he can, and he really is the focal point of the Republican Party. So I think it's a wide open lane for Democrats. The question is, can they seize it? Because a lot of donors to Democrats, especially moderates, are really pro-data center. So we'll see if they're able to work around that.
So, but just to crystallize the message here, you mentioned Bernie Sanders. Is the Democratic message on data center national moratorium until we can figure out how this should be handled?
It's a fair point that it hasn't coalesced around a particular idea. There's obviously moratorium. We need to negotiate, have community input. I think being opposed to it, or at least being supportive of communities asking questions, is key. Yesterday, Donald Trump's EPA announced that they're not going to have any public comment on the permitting process for data center construction, right? They are actively moving to the pro-data center position. So Democrats can be opposed to it even if they don't have a coherent, necessarily policy thing that they've coalesced around right now.
Well, Rosemary, let's have you weigh in on this, because this is actually an issue, if we bring it back to the Texas elections today, where President Trump once issued a rare rebuke to Texas's governor, Greg Abbott, over his plans to pause permits so that they can get guardrails in place. How does it work when you have politicians that have to balance the narrative between being competitive with, say, China, but also these voter concerns?
Well, first of all, we are a digital economy, and data centers are the backbone of that digital economy. We have had data centers in this country since 1940. They are prevalent in every aspect of our economy. And it is so critical that we get out there and that there is a conversation about what is truth and what is false. And I think that's the struggle right now. I think that there is not a clear message out there about, data centers and how much energy they use, how much water they use, are they too loud or not? And I think that that's where this conversation has to start. And otherwise, it is going to become a big part of the conversation is in the fall as part of the election cycle. But I really think that, there's so much misinformation out there that we really need to have a conversation about what is true and what is false.
Well, it does, I have to admit, feel like a pretty bipartisan issue at this point. When we bring this up with lawmakers, it was Governor Spencer Cox last evening, who had joined us for a series of interviews over the past couple of years about the growth of data centers, alternative energy sources that he was tapping to make it happen. Everyone stops down and gives us an extended answer on this, which really underscores this fear that they seem to have on both sides about this issue that they're all catching up with right now.
Yeah, and I think Rosemary's really smart, but the sort of pro data center, we need to get this misinformation perspective she just shared, is going to be a total loser with Democrats and Republicans.
Do you believe that China's putting stuff on social media to turn people away from data center? How many people have ever seen a data center?
Plenty of people in Loudoun County right down the street.
Well, that's
right?
true.
But look, I do think the Chinese may be doing this, but what I have to say is that the opposition is real. Americans do not like what they hear about AI. It says we're going to fire your dad. We're going to make sure you never get a job, right? We're going to steal your information. We're going to chop up books to train our models. People don't like it, and this is their point of veto, and it's cutting through millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in lobbying being done by these companies towards politicians, even on the Republican side. It's truly amazing.
Wow.
Well, Rosemary, we'll give you the final word on this. I know you were about to weigh in there.
No, I was just going to say, again, we have to not continue to spread things that aren't true. We have to continue to educate people. What is AI? What is it not? What is a data center? What is it not? And I think that that's such a critical part. I have a daughter who just graduated from college, and she has a background in AI. I'm amazed to see what she is capable of doing. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity out there. And I just think that we need to not create fear and spread fear, that we really need to have an honest conversation about what this is and what it's not.
All right. Our political panel today, Rosemary, Becchi, founder and president of Jersey First and Republican strategist, alongside Doug Farrar, principal at Maywood Strategies and a Democratic strategist. Thank you both for joining us here on Bloomberg. And of course, we will continue to cover this conversation, all of it tying in to the AI spend after a blockbuster outlook from Nvidia yesterday. So let's get a check on the markets today. And for that, we're going to head over to World Headquarters and Charlie Pellet in New York.
Hi, thank you very much, Tyler and Joe. Indeed, talking about AI. Let's begin with the poster child. We're talking about Nvidia, the stock up now by 9.3% after last night's absolute blowout report. Nvidia right now, again, bears repeating, up 9.3%, helping give a big lift to techs in general and also the broader market. S&P higher by 60 points. You're on the GIP screen on the Bloomberg, very close to session highs right now, up 0.8%. Dow Industrials up 206 on the Dow, a gain of 0.4%. NASDAQ up 1.5%. NASDAQ 100 up 1.2%. The Bloomberg Mag 7 index up by 1.6%. The SOX, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange Semiconductor Index, up 1.7%. We've got the 2-year 4.21%. The 10-year ahead of Kevin Warsh tomorrow morning at Jackson Hole. 10-year at 4.66%. The 30-year 5.18%. Gold right now up 0.5%, $46.12 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.7%. WTI 82.77 a barrel. Brent 88.77, up by 1.1%. Bitcoin up 2.7%, holding above 80,552 on a Bitcoin. Briefly, Dollar Tree lower after earnings. Right now, we do have a Dollar Tree trading down. Also reporting earnings, Dollar General, it lifted its view on annual revenue after a quarter sales beat. Dollar General up 4.1%, Dollar Tree down 4.2%. Joe and Tyler, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie. Thank you, sir. Charlie Pellet will be back at the top of the hour with another read on Wall Street. Day after Nvidia earnings, he'll be here at 2 p.m. Eastern Time as we kick off Bloomberg Business Week daily on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Tyler Kendall in Washington. As we turn to Jackson Hole, we'll know by this time tomorrow what the message was from Kevin Warsh. Big questions about what he might say and how the market might interpret it. And ahead of our conversation with Kathryn Edwards, who's back with us today on Balance of Power, I want to bring you right to the scene. Michael McKee has been there for a couple days already ahead of the symposium and is with us right now live on Bloomberg TV and radio from Jackson Hole. Mike, how's it going out there? I'm just curious if you can bring us inside the process in the days that lead up to the speech. I know there were a lot of meetings, a lot of conversations that are happening in the days before the markets ever hear from the Fed chair. What are people doing with their time, and what are the conversations you're hearing? Is it just a big guessing game?
It's a big guessing game in terms of what Kevin Warsh is going to say. Nobody really knows except Kevin Warsh and maybe his top aides. So there's going to be a lot of interest when he steps to the microphone at 10 o'clock Wall Street time tomorrow. But there is a kind of an overarching question to it. Will he or won't he give the markets what they're looking for, which is some sort of clue as to how he plans to get to the 2% inflation target?
Mike, you are starting to have some of these conversations on the ground. I know you spoke with Jeff Schmidt earlier today, the Kansas City Fed president. He told you that the midterms won't impact the October meeting. How much is Fed independence looming over the conversations that you're having there on the ground?
Well, you know, it's sort of died out as a front page issue, except for the fact that Lisa Cook is now back in the news, and everybody here is tuned into Truth Social to see if Donald Trump tries to fire her before we leave Jackson Hole, which would indeed be kind of overwhelming news for the people here. But in general, people think that because of the Supreme Court decision for right now, the Fed is safe, and they're not too worried about that. Now, I don't know that Jeff Schmidt wasn't just giving us the party line. They don't want to tell the markets we're having a meeting and you shouldn't even pay attention. But there is a very low likelihood that they would raise rates 5 days before the election.
Mike, can we stick on this thread of Fed Governor Lisa Cook? She sent this letter to the White House last night. We know that the Supreme Court ruled that President Trump can't fire her, at least immediately. But is the White House planning additional action? Do we know what other steps they could take here?
I'll give you the same answer I give you every question when you ask me what Donald Trump's going to do is, how does anybody know? But he has said he wants to fire her again. And the court said that he couldn't because he had not given her adequate notice and a chance to respond. So after the court decision, he had one of his aides send Lisa Cook a letter saying, you're fired, and we're giving you 3 weeks to respond. That 3 weeks was up yesterday. She sent a letter, her lawyer sent a letter to the White House outlining her defense, and now we're all waiting for the White House reaction.
All right, Michael McKee, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent, live from Jackson Hole. Thank you, as always. And we want to continue the conversation and bring in Kathryn Edwards, Bloomberg opinion columnist and co-host of the Optimist Economy podcast. So, Kathryn, let's just get your thoughts, all eyes tomorrow. What are you expecting and wanting to hear from Fed Chair Kevin Warsh as he takes the podium?
That's hard to say from a chair who has said he thinks communication should be more limited than in the past. I think that makes a lot of us even, maybe it's working the way he wants, that we're even in more anticipation of what he will say, since he said he doesn't want to say much, communicate much, give as much insight into what the Fed is thinking or doing, to have less forward guidance. So it puts an incredible weight on his words, and maybe shows the weakness of communicating less is that it leads to overinterpretation of the little that's said. But in terms of what I'd like to hear, I think I'm with, I would say, even the most casual viewer or follower of the Federal Reserve, is I'd like to hear a strong note of independence. That this is about responding to the needs of the U.S. economy and not about responding to the needs to a very loud and very vocal constituency of one.
Well, so is this, Kathryn, it's great to have you back. Is this a market that needs to be taken by the shoulders here? Hasn't Warsh kind of already made his point, to the extent that we're watching the bond market act up a little bit, some of the longest rates we've seen on the long bond in years?
I mean, that's hard to say what would make the bond markets, say, calm. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not clear how much his influence would extend there versus a Congress that is making better fiscal decisions, and what his role is in quelling the bond market, versus the Treasury, versus Congress just doing a better job. I'd be curious if he weighs in on that at all. I think that I'd be surprised if he brought it up directly. But then again, I'm also incredibly good at not predicting what Federal Reserve chairmen say.
Well, we actually are waiting on the Treasury Secretary, somebody else, to announce a fiscal consolidation plan, $40 trillion in national debt. How are you thinking about this? What could actually be announced that would move the needle when it comes to the deficit?
I'm not sure what the Treasury could announce that would move the needle. I mean, we'd have to have congressional action to either increase revenue or decrease spending, something that Congress has been, frankly, loathsome to do. I think we're at such an incredible period of history to have a deficit as large as we have now in peacetime, when the unemployment rate is close to 4%. I mean, it's just a really remarkable moment in history of just how fractured and how irresponsibly governed our fiscal situation has been. So I'm not sure what a consolidation plan from the Treasury could really quell, when what we need is Congress to do a better job at its primary job.
Yeah, we talked to Michael Faulkner a couple days ago here, the former Deputy Treasury Secretary, and he suggested that the message should be, no, it's not a two-handle, it's 2%, and that this Federal Reserve will continue to act until inflation gets to that level. What would the bond market do if he said that?
I mean, I have to wonder. You have to wonder which master he's serving when we're talking about this, right? We want to keep borrowing costs low because we're borrowing up to the hilt, right? We're taking on so much debt and still actively borrowing and paying so much for it that, his actions in the short-term market last week and wanting to be aggressive about keeping rates low, is on some level fundamentally at odds with the idea that we need to raise interest rates, including on debt issuances, in order to get prices down. I mean, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Stewarding the economy requires very tough, very painful choices some of the time. This is why I think going back to what Warsh will talk about tomorrow, is he really going to make the case that we need to have aggressive interest rate increases, knowing what that means for the debt? Or is he going to make the case that we, need to take care of our fiscal situation, knowing that kind of the poster child for fiscal irresponsibility is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act? I don't see how the lack of sustainability in our situation can be talked about openly or honestly without incredible criticism of the current administration.
When does the 10-year hit 5%?
Y'all, I don't know.
I have to. I know it's not fair.
I'll just say somewhere between the next 1 and 12 months.
Hey, all right, in the next year, Tyler.
Well, we did want to ask you about some of the actions that the administration is taking, including yesterday the president signed a proclamation that's going to lift tariffs on about 300,000 metric tons of beef for the next 90 days. This is actually a consumer product where consumers kept buying beef despite high prices, but data is starting to show us that there are cracks and that trend may now be reversing. Just from your viewpoint as we talk about higher prices, what do you think could be done to help sustain lower beef prices after this temporary action?
Well, I thought his announcement was a remarkable admission that his administration's policy of tariff is increasing prices, considering that his plan to ameliorate price pain in one market was through a reduction in tariffs. I felt like that was plain as day. Kind of what we had all been saying this whole time was that he is pursuing an inflationary policy. I think when it comes to the long-term price of beef and other goods in our economy, this is a war we're fighting on multiple fronts. Food, in some ways, is emblematic of this because there are lots of things that are outside of the control of food producers. I think, from my understanding is that if you talk to farmers, drought and wildfire are massive constraints on their ability to have a stable supply or a large enough supply. But at the same time, we're talking about an industrial sector that is highly, highly concentrated. I mean, there's very little competition. You're going to have monopolies or duopolies at various parts of the supply chain. Just last year, there was a massive out-of-court settlement for price fixing in beef production. So there are things outside of our control that we need to be able to better manage with an economy and economic policy that is responsive to the needs of producers here in the U.S. At the same time, we've got deep weaknesses in our industrial organization that comes from a reliance on over-concentration that we've ignored in the past because prices were low enough. So having a concentrated food sector was okay so long as the price is low. It's not anymore. Versus policy that is essentially aggravating the existing problem, like tariffs, not adequately addressing it, like giving a very small share of beef imports a free pass for a period of time, and still not getting to the demands of the American consumer, which is they just want to be able to afford their life.
Yeah. This is a tough one. Even MAGA cattle ranchers are crying foul in states like Texas and in Montana, concerned that prices will be depressed for a longer period of time because of these imports. You add the situation with Canada, and in our remaining 30 seconds or so here, Kathryn, it does make you wonder what the farmer bailout is going to look like next year.
I mean, like it would add to the deficit.
I think that
we need to bail out farmers and producers, and it's going to be a deficit expense again because of the organization of our economy and fiscal responsibility.
It's great to have you back with us, Kathryn. Bloomberg opinion columnist. Look for her on the terminal and at Bloomberg.com. Kathryn Edwards, the Optimist Economy Podcast. Love a guest with a good mic. Tyler, Kendall, and I will be back on the late edition of Balance of Power. We'll have a lot more to talk about at 5 p.m. Eastern, Bloomberg TV and radio.